Hi, I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, your host on East Brunswick Television. I'm here today with Professor Andrew Urban from American Studies at Rutgers in New Brunswick, and he's the curator of this marvelous exhibition which is taking place in the Douglas Library on the Douglas campus of Rutgers University in New Brunswick. The name of this exhibition is States of Incarceration, and Professor Urban helped curate it and set it up, and we're going to take a little tour today, and he's going to explain to us the content of this exhibition. So welcome.
Thank you, Angus.
Yeah. And perhaps we'll follow up a little bit. I understand this is done, it's a consortium of several universities.
Right, so this whole exhibit is organized through the Humanities Action Lab, which is a partnership between 19 universities and colleges around the country.
Including Rutgers.
Including Rutgers, both Rutgers New Brunswick, but also Rutgers Newark. Basically, back in the fall 2015, each of the universities and colleges involved had a class. In that class, students researched, wrote about, interpreted, and analyzed, and ultimately curated exhibit panels that focused on what we're calling kind of a local case study that connected to issues locally in their own proverbial backyard. They then either did, a panel or two panels. All of those panels came together to create the exhibit as a whole, and then the exhibit has since been touring around the country, going to all of the different universities and colleges and community partners that they worked with to be on display in those communities. And so each of the panels that students did through their university or college course looks at, again, an aspect, a local story relating somehow to the history of mass incarceration and all of its different chapters.
As I have walked through the exhibition, I've been very impressed with the professional quality and the graphic work of these panels, which leads me to ask, who paid for all this?
So the way it worked, and this kind of gives some insights into the kind of structure of the Humanities Action Lab more generally. Basically, all of the partners contributed a sum of money.
Is that a government agency?
No, the Humanities Action Lab is just a nonprofit organization. Right now, it's based in Newark. It's actually affiliated with Rutgers Newark. Before then, it was actually at the New School in New York City. So, but it's its own independent entity.
So all these participating universities kick in some money.
Right. So basically, as a kind of collective or partnership or collaboration, we all kicked in money. And the idea is then that also we don't necessarily have to be beholden to a kind of institution like a museum. We don't have to seek out funding in the same ways we might otherwise. And it gives us a fair amount of independence to pursue topics like mass incarceration. Before this exhibit, the Humanities Action Lab, or its predecessor, the Guantanamo Public Memory Project, as you might recall from a couple of years back, worked on an exhibition that looked at the history of the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And part of the strategy there is that a lot of more traditional brick and mortar museums don't necessarily want to take on these challenging, at times controversial topics, but through the mechanism of the Humanities Action Lab and how it's structured, we have the leeway or independence to kind of look at these subjects.
Well, Professor Urban, let's take a look. Let's go out to the rotunda and take a look.
Sure.
Well, here we are in the rotunda of the Mabel Smith Douglas Library, and I want to start with the panel that was developed by students at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. It mainly deals with Seabrook Farms down in South Jersey in Cumberland County, and I'd like to ask Professor Urban to tell us a little bit about this panel.
Sure. So what you're looking at here is a panel that focuses on the history of Seabrook Farms, and again, specifically through the lens of this history of incarceration and how Seabrook Farms relates to incarceration. The title of our panel is How is the Racialized Prisoner the Ideal Worker? And what that refers to, and what the students I taught at Rutgers really engaged in when they began researching Seabrook Farms, is how this frozen foods agribusiness in southern New Jersey, outside Bridgeton, if you're familiar with the geography, in Cumberland County, how this large frozen foods agribusiness that by the 1950s was the largest producer of frozen foods in the United States, came to recruit and ultimately employ incarcerated Japanese Americans. And I use the term incarcerated Japanese Americans rather than interned Japanese Americans or internment, in part because if you study Japanese American history in the United States, scholars will argue that internment is actually a misnomer. That's a technical legal term that applies to the detention of enemy aliens during wartime. And of the approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans who end up in camps out west, 60% or thereabouts are actually American citizens by birth. They're never subjected to any due process or actual specific charges, but they're incarcerated nonetheless in these camps. By around early 1943, they're given the option to engage or participate in a type of supervised work release or parole. And so at that point, Seabrook Farms begins recruiting Japanese Americans. Roughly 2,500 end up coming to southern New Jersey, living and working in what essentially is a company town. Seabrook Farms provides its own housing, has its own shops and commissary, has even its own postal system and school system. And we call it kind of racialized prisoner because if you follow the arc of Japanese American incarceration, the reason they're incarcerated to begin with is that they're deemed somehow incapable of assimilating, becoming true Americans, in part because of their ancestry or how they're understood as a distinct race apart from the American public.
So, if I may,
Sure,
it's better than being in a prison camp, but it's not really freedom.
It's definitely not freedom in the sense that even to go to Seabrook Farms in the first place, individuals had to be vetted and scrutinized by various federal agencies at Seabrook Farms themselves. While they're not kept under lock and key or armed guard, they can't just go and decide they want to work somewhere else. They can't decide they're just going to leave and relocate to Philadelphia. Every move they make has to receive permission from the federal government. It has to be approved. And so that's in some ways why Seabrook Farms, I would argue, was attracted to this workforce in the first place. During the 1930s, the company witnesses a number of labor strikes, attempts of the workforce to unionize. And so there's a kind of managerial strategy among the corporate board, you could say, at Seabrook Farms, where the at least plan or imagined goal of bringing in incarcerated Japanese American laborers is to have a more compliant and controllable workforce. A workforce, again, as I point out, couldn't just leave to find better paying jobs where perhaps the working conditions were better and so forth. As I was mentioning, in the 1930s, Seabrook Farms was actually the site of what was at the time the largest agricultural strike in the United States' history. One of the images that we have tried to highlight here in the panel is of a group of local police officers and deputy. We've found sources that indicate that in some cases these were actually local members of the KKK that the company hired to help break up the strike, to help put workers back in line. Again, a lot of this goes into the strategy of the company in the years that will follow in terms of recruiting other workers. So by the early 1940s, Seabrook Farms is actually bringing in guest workers from Barbados and Jamaica. It's recruiting agricultural workers from the US South on a seasonal basis. And by the middle of World War II, it's even relying on, as this image demonstrates, German POWs that it's recruiting from local POW camps in New Jersey who are working alongside, as you can see in this image, Japanese Americans. A final group that I always like to point out also was eventually brought to Seabrook Farms were Japanese Peruvians. During the course of the Second World War, the United States actually brings roughly 5,000 Japanese Peruvians from Peru to the United States. These individuals are detained in a camp in Crystal City, Texas. And then when the war ends, the US government actually goes about trying to deport these individuals to Japan, not to Peru. In fact, the Peruvian government refuses to take back the Japanese Peruvians who have been brought to the US. And so again, Seabrook Farms kind of intervenes in this situation as there are a number of legal cases pending as to whether these Japanese Peruvians will have to go back to Japan. The company ends up recruiting about 500 to come and work at the site while their cases are pending. I guess I should mention one last group actually as well. These are refugees from Europe, mainly Estonians who are living in displaced persons camps in Germany. In 1948, Charles Seabrook, the company's founder and director, goes over to the displaced person camps in Germany, and again, brings over roughly about 500 Estonians. These are individuals who are allowed to enter the United States only after they have employment and housing lined up. So again, it's a kind of situation where the company can provide that in exchange then to have access to the refugee labor. One of the things that the various partners involved in this project discovered that is, it's virtually impossible to talk about the history of incarceration in the United States or the present day of incarceration in the United States without looking at the subject of immigration detention. And so one of, I think, the kind of most interesting panels was done by my colleagues and students up at Rutgers Newark, and this looks at the Elizabeth Detention Center, which to this day is actually one of the largest facilities detaining immigrants facing deportation in the entire United States. In the 1990s, Elizabeth Detention Center was run by the Esmore Correctional Services firm, a private prison group that maintains various facilities. And in the 1990s, Esmore was actually sued for essentially negligence, for failing to provide proper food, proper housing conditions or accommodations in the prison. And so I love the Rutgers Newark panel in part because it tells the story of the lawsuit that detained immigrants brought against this private corporation, how they used this moment to essentially lobby for dignified, humane treatment while incarcerated. When I teach courses on incarceration here at Rutgers, I often highlight Rikers as an example or a case study. One of the effective ways in which I've been able to use this exhibit, even with tours here on campus. I've been working with a number of undergraduate students as well who have been leading their peers and classmates through this exhibit and then engaging them in dialogue about the issues the exhibit raises. And in some ways, I think Rikers always kind of comes to the foreground because it's been the subject of so much infamous media coverage in the last couple years. Many of you might know about Khalif Browder, the young man from the Bronx who was detained at Rikers Island for approximately 900 days simply because he couldn't afford the $3,000 bail that he was originally required to post after he was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. And if you know anything about Khalif Browder's story, it's a huge tragedy in the sense that it reveals how so many people in this country are incarcerated, not because they've ever been convicted of a crime, but again, simply because they can't pay bail in order to be released. In fact, I think at about 60 to 70% of all the detainees at Rikers have not paid bail. They're not there because they've actually been convicted of any crime. In Khalif Browder's case, while he was at Rikers, he faced abuse from the guards, fights with other inmates, solitary confinement for what they estimate to be roughly 700 to 800 of the 900 days he was incarcerated at Rikers. And he was so in some ways traumatized by his experience that even when he was released, he simply couldn't readjust to being on the outside, and eventually he took his own life. And so it's a powerful story, obviously, to share with students. Rikers in some ways is also a local history. I know I live in New York City, even though I commute out here to New Jersey to teach, and so it's something that's in my backyard. Mayor de Blasio has even proposed closing it down in the next 10 years or so. And the exhibit panel that the New School did in focusing on Rikers highlights not only some of the stories that I've already mentioned, but some other aspects I don't think we really regularly consider. So if you look here, for instance, you can see actually these interesting succession of subway maps from 1939 basically all the way up to the present. And what it highlights is that on these subway maps, Rikers often simply doesn't appear. It's omitted from the map altogether. They make the argument, I think it's correct, that this is in some ways part of how New Yorkers' cognitive geography works. They simply don't want to acknowledge this island north of LaGuardia that houses so many inmates, that has been the subject of so many controversies. They'd rather just pretend it doesn't exist at all. Another feature that the students did at the New School, which I think is really excellent as well, is they actually compiled a list of songs that mention Rikers. If you listen to R&B, to hip hop, to folk music, I could go on and on. Rikers has been this constant point of reference. And so in some ways, this is a Rikers mix CD, right? All of the various songs that reference Rikers and what it means to different artists who have had loved ones, friends, relatives incarcerated there. Interspersed throughout the exhibit are these blue panels that provide questions that bring together the different parts of the exhibit and frames the interventions and the significance of the exhibit as a whole. I think these are important questions because in some ways they are questions that seem that they have just simple common sense answers, but if you poke at them and delve into them, they become quite complicated. So for instance, this panel poses the question, what is a crime? Who is a criminal? And on some level, right, the simple answer that I think some of us might be prompted to give is, well, a criminal is somebody who commits a crime, is arrested and tried and convicted, and therefore is a criminal. In actuality, though, if you look at how the criminal justice system works in the United States, that quickly falls apart upon further research. In particular, we know from myriad studies that not only is law enforcement biased in respect to race, but also in respect to social class. If you're poor, if you're a person of color, it's been shown again and again, you're far more likely to be arrested. Also, we know that there's a lot of discrimination or disparity in respect to sentencing. So what I mean by that is when you are convicted of a crime or if you plead guilty to a crime, again, based on the color of your skin, based on your social class, you're more likely to spend substantial time in jail if you're a person of color, if you're poor. In fact, in New Jersey, we know that it was reported in 2016 that the state of New Jersey actually had among the highest rates of racial and class disparity in sentencing of any state in the United States. This was so pronounced that actually Governor Christie, as one of his last acts before leaving office, signed a bipartisan bill that is going to investigate why racial disparity is so high. I should say racial and ethnic disparity is so high in the state of New Jersey. So one of the things that we try to get students to think about when they're touring this exhibit, when they're viewing the panels, is what they need to do to, again, question basic assumptions about how the criminal justice system works. The panel here actually addresses this issue, where is the carceral state? Again, maybe that would provide a simple answer. The carceral state is where prisons are located. Again, I think it's more complicated when we think about the complex geography that mass incarceration produces and how certain areas, especially rural towns where prisons are located, rely on incarceration not just because a jail is there, but because it's become the most important means of employment for a region. So down in New Jersey, in southern New Jersey, in Bridgeton, for instance, there's a county, state, and federal jail, all in the immediate surrounding area. And these prisons are basically the largest employer in the region. So they have a lot of political clout. They're important to the local area. So incarceration in those regions matters not just a matter of confining individuals who've committed a crime, but it matters as a means to organizing a local economy. It even goes as far as the fact that in many areas, prisons actually count towards various forms of state and federal representation. So prisoners are actually counted among the local population for purposes of representation in these legislative bodies, even though the prisoners themselves can only not vote, obviously, while they're imprisoned, but upon leaving prison basically lose that right on a permanent basis, no longer have the ability to take and partake in suffrage. And to agree, that's been a really important point we've emphasized throughout as well. People, again, I think to some degree know that if you're convicted of a felony and then are released from prison, you lose your right to vote, but you also lose right to potentially access loans to go to college, to buy a house or a car. You lose the ability to be protected from housing discrimination in respect to where you can live, and I could go on, right? So part of it is also thinking about how incarceration matters and impacts this country well beyond the actual moment in which people are in jail. In the field of museum studies, there's been a recent push in the last couple decades to turn exhibits into more interactive forums where visitors can not only learn about the subject, but also weigh in on their personal relation to it. And so when the Humanities Action Lab was designing the States of Incarceration exhibit, that was something that they wanted to highlight as well, and that all of the partners were enthusiastic about incorporating into this exhibit. And so what you're looking at here are actually a series of questions or prompts that after visitors, and in this case at Rutgers, students in particular, have come and toured the exhibit, they can take a moment and grab these cards, fill them out anonymously, and then post them on this board. And the idea as well is that incarceration is so significant and so impactful in the United States that there are very few individuals left in this country who haven't been impacted on a personal level by incarceration. And so the questions ask people to consider: I've broken the law and not been caught. I've been or I know someone who has been arrested or incarcerated. And it provides visitors to the exhibit with an opportunity to process anew those relationships, their connections to mass incarceration, having learned about some of the critical questions that mass incarceration raises. So the prompt here is, I've been or I know someone who has been arrested or incarcerated. And again, visitors to the exhibition then have a chance to use these cards and respond to the prompt. They're asked to give a response that's not as academic or based in research as much as it's a reflection of what they feel. So in this case, the response is, sad that this is the reality my friends have faced. Sad there's nothing I can do about it. Sad many white people will get away with the same crimes, if not more. And the individual who wrote this response indicated that they identify as Hispanic in their ethnicity. And so, on some level, maybe this isn't the ideal card to share. One of the purposes of this exhibit is to encourage people to get involved and find ways as voters, but also as potentially civically involved individuals, that they can find means or groups that are working toward reform of some of the more prevalent issues in incarceration. But even if this individual does feel to a degree that things are hopeless, that the system is in many respects corrupted by racial and ethnic bias, I do think that there's still an importance to giving them a kind of platform to vent, right? Because it is stigmatized to have relatives or friends who have been incarcerated, or to have been incarcerated by yourself. There is often a reluctance to talk about these issues, to address them in public forums. Again, even though this is an anonymous statement, I hope at least on some level expressing it is potentially a first step for this person and others to consider what they can do on a more substantive level to get involved with reforming and changing mass incarceration.
Professor Urban, I want to thank you for showing us around this marvelous exhibit, The States of Incarceration. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Angus, and I'm glad to have had a chance to share all of this wonderful student work with everybody.